Yo, what's going on, everybody? Today I'm gonna talk about Dalton Smith versus Subriel Matias. Excuse my voice, I did just wake up, but I just really couldn't wait to get this video out. So here we go. Obviously, the first round I gave to Dalton Smith. Matias does what he usually does, which is just to sit back and basically let his opponent punch on his high guard and burn themselves out. But surely Smith was aware of this, so he didn't push the envelope too much. He utilized his jab, he stabbed to the body. He was throwing bombs, but he didn't empty the tank. He refused to empty the tank. One thing that I do want to note is that I do understand that Matias did get stopped in this fight, but this man's punch resistance is, or at least was, insane. Smith landed a clean looping right that snapped Matias' head around, but it genuinely looked like Matias didn't even feel it, which is absolutely nuts. But in round two, Smith showed me the thing that I really just don't love to see about him. I like Smith, right? I was rooting for him to win this fight, and I even predicted him to win this fight by stoppage. So when I say this, it ain't hate, but I digress. I first saw this when he fought Zepeda. Smith can sometimes look skittish when he's in there with somebody who he knows has power. Prior to knocking out Zepeda, he looked mad uncomfortable in there with him. And the same thing here with Matias. There's like a slight panic in his face. He's just not composed. But you know what? Panic or not, he did what he was supposed to. He clinched away. Despite the downpour of boos from the crowd, Smith completely ignored them and clinched to kill any action Matias was looking for. This was clearly a tactic, right? It was not out of fear. So I did give the round to Dalton because he also landed many clean shots, although Matias never really looked hurt. Now the third, fourth, and fifth rounds, those rounds was a dogfight. And truthfully, as a Smith supporter, as I watched it live, I thought Matias' stoppage was on its way. Like, I thought he was gonna stop Smith. Smith was fighting Matias' fight. He abandoned the lateral movement, and for the most part, he abandoned clinching as well. He just went shot for shot with Matias. He stood 10 toes and went to war with him. And I'm telling y'all, when I first watched this, I was worried. I didn't like what Smith was doing. I didn't like how he just stood there and traded, because we know what Matias can do, right? We know he's pretty damn durable, and we know he usually outlasts his opponent. He always welcomes a war of attrition, and he always prevails. So yeah, I was worried for Smith, man. I thought he was working much harder than Matias was, and Matias was starting to land clean shots, especially at the end of the fourth, where he landed a flurry of short hooks. But hey, Smith showed us what he had. He bit down and showed his dog. He showed his grit in every exchange. Anytime Matias got off on him, he fired back immediately. He refused to let Matias go downhill on him. He refused to give Matias hope, to have him believe that he was hurting him. And I actually believe that Smith got the best of almost every exchange. I thought he was the more accurate fighter, and I thought he landed the cleaner, bigger shots. It's just, I think Matias wore most of the shots well, whereas Matias' short, almost arm punches really had a visible effect on Dalton Smith. Like, Smith's head would rock every time he got touched, and at times he'd even lose balance. So visibly, optically, it looked like Matias was getting the better in the exchanges. But nah, Smith's superior technique made it so he was the one who was actually landing the bigger, effective, more damaging shots throughout the entirety of the fight. And it all paid off for him. At the end of the fifth, where he finally chipped away enough and landed 2 1-2s on Matias' chin. The first 1-2 stunned Matias, and he followed it up with another 1-2 on that exposed Puerto Rican chin, and down goes the juggernaut. But can someone tell me, was it just me, or did it feel like Smith took forever to follow up once he had Matias buzzed there with the first 1-2? It literally felt like 10 seconds passed. But I digress. Matias got up to his feet, but the ref waved it off. I thought it was a bit premature. But hey, man, the ref, he literally had the best view of that war. And he probably thought that Matias really just took enough punches for the night, and you can't fault the man for that. He didn't want nobody's blood on his hands. And Dalton Smith is your newest WBC world champion. And truthfully, I just couldn't be happier. When I saw him on the floor after the stoppage, man, I had goosebumps. As soon as I saw this dude fight a few years ago, I liked him. I liked his style, and I always backed him. I even made a post a couple of years ago saying that I want to see Dalton Smith versus Ryan Garcia, as crazy as it sounds. And I made a video titled "One Day Dalton Smith Will Be Your Favorite Fighter" last year. And I'm happy he finally got his opportunity, and he seized it. He absolutely seized it. In his first fight on US soil, he fought an absolute killer for his belt, and he stopped him fighting his fight. That's cold. That's badass. He could have stunk up the place and boxed Matias. He was capable of that. But nah, he stood 10 toes and went to war. And man, it was an incredible win. Matias was a huge step up for Dalton Smith, and he really showed his mettle tonight, or last night, I should say. Um, I thought he looked damn good. He was accurate. His shot selection and punch placement was on point. He was hitting Matias clean everywhere, down the middle, around his guard, to the body, and his punch variety was tremendous. He hit Matias with what seemed like every shot in the book, and despite working harder than he ever has to, his technique and form never was sloppy. He stayed sharp and accurate, and his punches stayed true, without much fat. Despite the fight not taking place in his preferred distance, he still managed to get enough leverage in most of his punches. He just very good stuff from Dalton Smith, man. I've been watching him for years, and he even showed me a lot that I've never seen from him. I particularly liked him taking the fight to Matias. He did well to snipe and shoot power shots in mid-range, but he also mixed it up by smothering Matias, so Matias couldn't get much torque on his punches, and he would take a step back to fire his own power shots back in the mid-range. Seriously, great stuff from Dalton. You gotta have massive balls to attempt that game plan, and you gotta have great timing, precision, and power to execute it. But I think it's enough with the praises. Let's get down to what I didn't like, and that is his defense. Dalton Smith seriously needs to move his head more. He needs to find a way to avoid the jab, and this is actually an ongoing problem. He's just so bad at defending the jab, and I believe it's gonna cost him one day if he doesn't figure that out soon. He also needs to work on his composure. As I said earlier, when he's in there with a heavy hitter, he needs to find his calm. But other than that, from what I saw, that kid Dalton Smith is nice, man. He does have a deep bag, and he got real good power, and now he's a world champ. So shout out to my boy Dalton Smith. Now I turn to Subriel Matias. The reason I predicted Smith to win this fight was really because I thought Matias was due to get stopped. He's reckless. He's super entertaining. Don't get me wrong, he's super entertaining. He's one of the few fighters today who I consider must-watch TV. But it's because of his style and lack of defense. If Matias still wants to compete at the world level, he must drastically improve his defense, in my opinion. He's made a living going through all these wars, but a man can only go through so many wars until their chin is shattered, until their punch resistance wears off. If he wasn't already, I believe Matias is now a declining fighter. After catching so many big clean shots in this fight and in his last fight against Puello, surely his chin is damaged. It has been cracked, in my opinion. So if he wants to continue fighting, he definitely needs to sacrifice some of his offense for some defense. But I don't really have much else to say about Matias. Shout out to him. He continues to provide great, entertaining fights. And as I said earlier, I love watching him fight. And shout out to him for giving Dalton Smith a world title opportunity, you know. But for his sake, I really hope he improves his defense. Um, this was a long video and I had a lot to say, but now I want to know what you think. You know, did any of you predict Smith to beat Matias? And who do you guys want to see Matias fight next? Who do you want Smith to fight next? I do want to say thank you so much for watching this video. Please leave a like and subscribe, and have a wonderful day.